Okay, I mean it's old hand for most of you, but for those of you joining us for the first time, we will talk a little bit about some housekeeping items. We're going to give you a brief introduction to LEC and stress that at any time, please feel free to reach out to LEC if we can be of any assistance to your projects, to your investments, or otherwise. And from there, I will be introducing our guest speaker, Dr. Michael Lakeman, for today's panel. And we look forward to having a great, great conversation. So, next slide. Excuse me. Okay, so we're down to one housekeeping item. We say it every week or every month. Uh, Questions and answers are an integral part of what make these webinars really, really helpful to lots of people. So we're going to ask you, as the webinar proceeds, to please enter questions. If you are able to use the Q&A tab, if you are within the LEC framework, use the Q&A tab. If that is not available to you, please simply use the chat feature and enter your questions. I will then be correlating with my colleagues in the back, and we will get those questions to Michael for he and his panel to address. And any questions we don't get to, we will pull together and get folks answers to their questions via email if Michael and the team have time. Okay. So again, for those of you joining us for the first time, LEC is a 30-year-old firm. We are in the bioeconomy space. We have a wide array of experts, about 150 plus experts. They are from all walks of life. I would say, in summary, we are deepest in terms of our technical and operational know-how. We are a collection of folks that have been there and done it. Half of our team has been a C-suite executive. 97% are PhDs or other advanced degrees. And we have evaluated somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 billion of projects in our 30 years. And our services, as you can see on the slide there, range from funding and diligence through project development operations, as well as all the way to expert witness services, which have all been anchors of what we do. And the areas of expertise, the vertical areas, the bio-based materials and chemicals, bioenergy and biofuels, biotechnologies, biopharmaceuticals, and feedstocks, are all in many ways interrelated. And one of the things we're excited about is the creation of centers of excellence within LEC. And today is one example of those centers of excellence, which will cross areas like feedstocks and others, as Michael and the team talk through SAF and what the market is, what the market faces. And we're looking forward to a very educational session. And please, reminder, questions, lob them into the Q&A or into the chat. Now, if we had an hour to introduce Michael with all of his curriculum vitae here, we would never get to the content. So let me highlight a few items. One, he is a PhD in botany out of the University of Washington. He is also, his main claim to fame, well, many claims to fame, but one of the ones I love the most is that he was part of the team at Imperium Renewables that created the first sustainable aviation fuel that was put into an airplane and flown. And it wasn't just flown, it was actually ingested by the owner of said plane, who was Sir Richard Branson, Virgin Airways. Oh, he's a cutting edge guy. I don't think it went well on his digestive tract, but we will let Michael tell that story if he so chooses. But really, we're thrilled to have him as a part of LEC. He's a project director with us. He is also the head of our SAF COE. And with that, let me take a second and turn it over to Michael. Michael, over to you.
Thanks, JD, and thank you all for taking the time to join this webinar and catching up on what's happening in the world of SAF. As JD mentioned, I've been there for the whole journey of SAF. It's really been kind of my professional life's journey to help push SAF forward, and so it's great to have this opportunity to share with an audience as broad as you all where we've come from and where we're going with SAF. So next slide, please. So as we run through today's webinar, we'll look at why we're interested in SAF, what are the drivers there, and why is this an imperative for the aviation industry. We'll look at what types of SAF are available and how the technology is advancing. We'll take a look at the progress of commercialization. When is SAF going to be available? And then we'll look at how SAF development is happening, how partnerships are coming together, and what the business cases look like. We'll also mention briefly the Centre of Excellence for SAF at LEC. So what are the drivers of SAF for the aviation industry? Next slide. Essentially, aviation has a carbon problem, carbon emissions from aviation. One of the hardest areas to decarbonize from any industrial source of aviation. And there aren't really that many easy tools to do so. Next slide. So we look at the progress of aviation. One thing is for certain is that it's continuously innovating and it's continuously getting more efficient. So because of the cost pressures, aviation has a strong imperative to burn less fuel. Fuel is a significant portion of the operating costs. He'll go back one slide for a second there. Yeah, so because fuel is such a significant cost driver, there is already existing pressure outside of the questions of carbon emissions to lower the footprint, lower the fuel burn. And over the last 3 decades here, as we can see on this chart, over 50% improvement in the amount of fuel having to be burned to carry a passenger or carry a ton of freight through the air. So that's good progress, but the challenge is, the next slide, is that aviation is forecast to continue to grow faster than that rate of improvement of fuel efficiency. So if we look at this chart from an industry, aviation industry kind of working group, the Air Transport Action Group, ATAG, you can see significant growth out to the middle of the century. And all this growth, next slide, is happening in a context where there's increasing pressure through carbon pricing policies to reduce emissions across all aspects of the economy. And this chart shows the global spread of different forms of carbon pricing policies, such as emissions trading schemes, carbon taxes, etc. So significant portions, especially of the global north, are having the pressure of carbon policies, carbon pricing policies put onto the economy, including aviation. So next slide. Aviation is somewhat unique because it is not, international aviation at least, is not accounted for under the Paris Accords. So UNFCCC, Paris Accords, those apply to domestic economies. International aviation, so when planes fly from one country to another, they're not covered by the Paris Accords and UNFCCC negotiations in progress. For this reason, aviation internationally has had to establish its own carbon pricing scheme, and that's called CORSIA, the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. And this chart shows in the rollout of this CORSIA scheme that has a couple of different phases, a voluntary phase, and then the forecast compulsory phase from 2027. 76%, so over 3/4 of the international aviation traffic is covered by this carbon reduction scheme. And so this is international aviation looking after its own problems here and imposing a scheme that requires airlines to offset the growth of their emissions from a 2020 baseline. They can do that either through purchasing offsets or through the use of sustainable fuels for aviation. So next slide. So those two options I just mentioned are shown here, as well as potentially other levers to pull in terms of aircraft technology, electric or hybrid. Now, each of these options have their pros and cons. So for the rest of the talk, we'll talk about SAF, but we do need to look at the broader context of the tools available for aviation. So carbon offsets theoretically could be used to offset 100% of aviation emissions, but the challenges there are around acceptability, whether there'll be social license, quality of offsets, durability of offsets, and costs. I do need to nod towards other forms of energy use in aviation, such as batteries, electric, hybrid, hydrogen, but there are some real fundamental challenges with switching the form of the energy carrier for aviation, especially because we're talking about an international fleet flying from one place to another. In terms of infrastructure, there are some real challenges with deploying a whole new series of energy carriers, as well as some challenges around the energy density and the weight and the volume of these alternative energy carriers. So just also, next slide, want to talk a little bit about SAF and not just the carbon imperative. Next slide. But the fact that sustainable fuels for aviation offer some other significant strategic advantages. So this top chart shows in the US, all of these airports shown are supply constrained for jet fuel. So they have pipelines feeding into those airports where the supply is constrained. So it's going to be challenging for these airports to grow. They need to add additional fueling infrastructure. And so there's an opportunity in doing so that SAF can enhance the resiliency of those airports. And then SAF's also important because there's a domestic energy security angle to be taken advantage of here. And the chart on the bottom right shows down in this part of the world, in Australia, over time, as local refineries, petroleum refineries, have closed down, the share of the petroleum products that are imported, of refined petroleum products, is steadily increasing. And so this is one example where domestic low carbon fuels can provide both a carbon benefit as well as a strategic energy security benefit. Okay, so next slide, thanks.
Hey, Michael.
So, yeah.
Michael,
yeah.
Sorry, it's Ryan. I'm getting some feedback that we've got some tapping noise. I'm gonna try and mute everybody and then have you unmute yourself real quick. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
okay. Sure.
I'm hearing it, and it looks like other folks are hearing it as well. So I'm gonna hit the mute all button real quick and then let you unmute yourself, okay?
Sure. Okay, I am unmuted again. Thanks for that, Ryan. Okay, And do jump in if that continues to be a problem. Okay, next slide and next section. So that's the setup. Why is SAF important? Okay, we understand it's important. Now, what are we talking about when we talk about SAF? So the key thing here is that SAF is a drop-in fuel. We're not talking about any change to the chemical properties or the infrastructure or the engines and aircraft. We need to be able to blend and alternate with fossil fuels with the existing supply, need to be able to exceed, certainly meet, and if not exceed, the performance standards of traditional jet fuel. And it has to be backwards and forwards compatible when we're talking about the infrastructure investment and the fleet of aircraft flying around the globe. So how do we make SAF? What are we talking about then? Next slide. In creating a drop-in compatible aviation fuel. So there are many ways to make SAF. And look around you right now. You're possibly you're sitting at a wooden desk or a plastic desk. You've got a paper cup. You've got your coffee to go this morning. Anything that has carbon in it, even the air that you're breathing, that breath out of carbon dioxide, that carbon can be turned into SAF. It's technically possible to do it with any form of carbon. Of course, you need a whole lot of carbon. You need a big supply of feedstock, and you need it cheap enough to be able to make an affordable SAF. But the point being that there's just a multiple options and many different ways you could create SAF from a carbon-containing feedstock. This chart shows a range of different technologies. And then, yes, thanks for moving on here. When we look at the technical standard that approves and certifies these fuels, which is owned by ASTM, the ASTM D7566 and ASTM D1655 standards, there are a range of technologies that have been approved for use in commercial and military aviation. I won't go through and explain all of these. A couple of key ones to look at because they are relevant to the rest of the conversation. HEFA is a class of fuels that's jet fuel made from fats, oils, and greases. Fischer-Tropsch is a well-established technology pathway in terms of technical feasibility for making jet fuel or other hydrocarbons from any given source of carbon if you can gasify it first. ATJ SPK is a relevant one down here in the middle, Annex A5, and that's alcohol to jet. So you can take any form of bioalcohol, methanol, ethanol, butanol, and convert that into jet fuel. So there are a range of options that are approved, different maximum blend rates, but the fact that we can only blend 10% or 50% at this point into the acceptable fuel for use in an airplane is not too big of a challenge because we're not anywhere near that scale of supply availability at this stage. Next slide. So those are the kind of just a very brief view of the technology pathways. But they have to be based on a source of feedstock. Where's that carbon going to come from? And so just to preview here some interesting data that shows that the distribution of carbon-containing feedstock biomass around the world, biomasses and waste gases, is not evenly distributed. Just as the fossil fuel distribution around the globe is uneven. Some nations blessed with a large source of fossil resources. Different regions and different nations have certainly greater or lesser availability of biomass, and this is an area that is an LEC strength in terms of assessing biomass availability, sustainability, and cost. Okay, so moving on then. When can we expect SAF to be a commonplace and solution that is driving impact for aviation? So what's the status of the industry? So as we've just looked at, it's certainly a technically viable solution. Through the ASTM standards, there's a surety of an equal or better technical performance. Multiple pathways are approved. Moving on, there's definitely, next slide, sufficient demand in the marketplace for these fuels. So Ryan, can you move slides forward? Looks like it's hung up. Okay. So when the next slide comes up, we'll see that the demand for these fuels is significant. Overall, there's been over 140 offtake deals. Here we go, thanks. Signed between jet fuel users and producers of jet fuel, covering over 50 billion gallons worth of contracted offtake. This is that far outweighs the actual supply, and in large part that is driven by public pressure and policy pressure that strongly encourage the decarbonisation, as mentioned earlier. The challenge is there simply isn't enough supply to keep up with that 50 billion gallons. There's a fraction of a percent of that amount of annual production happening. The refinery capacity relative to that demand is small. At this stage, it's those heifer fuels only that are in routine commercial deployment. And really a big challenge here for SAF overall is that the cost of production is greater than the price of jet fuel on the open market. So you've got a premium that needs to be addressed through either policy measures, creative and innovative pricing structures, or ways to share the risk and cost across the stakeholders in the supply chain. And there's, especially for the heifer technology, there is strong competition for feedstock. So as aviation industry is decarbonising, so are many other industries that are looking to find bio-based alternatives. So one of the strongest ways that aviation can compete against those other uses of bio-based feedstocks and help close that cost-price gap is through supportive policy mechanisms. So this chart from the World Economic Forum shows, it's non-exhaustive, they acknowledge, but it shows the major specific mandates and targets. So the blue nations are areas where nations where there's expected to be certain volumes of fuel used, of SAF fuel used by airline operators by certain timelines, and those mandates actually can have T. So there's, sorry, I should say these are the green ones. In those cases where the sufficient volume is not used, there will be penalties. It could be rolling over of mandated volumes, such as happening in the EU. And so these mandates will be a very strong policy to help build that functioning marketplace where the supply will meet the demand. The blue nations show where there are targets, and they can be aspirational, but they also, in many cases, are backed up by significant support from governments, such as in the US with the SAF Grand Challenge, where there's been significant support for developing production capacity and all of the ancillary technology and infrastructure needs that help build the supply up. So next slide, please. So right now we do have a small market, and there is an expectation of growth in the near term. and that being driven by policy. So the chart on the top right here shows an analysis from ICCT in the EU area of the expectations around SAF production. And in their analysis, in an optimistic deployment, the little yellow triangles, in a decade, up to 5 to 6% of the jet fuel demand being met by SAF in the EU. Of course, that's the optimistic. They acknowledge there's a pessimistic deployment where the amount of SAF actually decreases. And this again shows the impact of that policy and political will can have on the trajectory of the SAF market. What appears to be certain is that as experience grows, as scale grows, that there are cost curve benefits to over time that are expected to be claimed. So the bottom left here shows from ICF their analysis of the CapEx requirements, as an example, CapEx requirements for 3 different classes of SAF technology declining over the time. Notably, the HEFA technology, which is reasonably mature at this point in time, isn't expected to significantly improve. It already has a low CapEx requirement. And on the feedstock side as well with HEFA, there's additional competition, and we expect into the future not a whole lot of efficiencies to be gained with HEFA feedstock costs. But the alcohol to jet and gasification routes do have significant learning by doing and economies of scale to capture to help bring down the CapEx and therefore the overall cost of the fuel produced. So ATAG in their Waypoint 2050 report looked at different scenarios, and this chart shows 3 different scenarios, and these are based on levels of ambition and rates of technology innovation. And these are, it's interesting to note the differences, but I think the similarities across these scenarios show that there are some expected trends over time and towards the middle of the century here, some distributions of the classes of feedstock or technologies or pathways that will make up the fuel mix. So I guess in all cases, there's a projection of significant increase in SAF over the coming decades, and that's a great thing. As we look then at these 4 different classes, you can see that both the HEFA and the waste gases are limited in their ultimate scalability. They're the 2 thin wedges there, the bottom one and then the second to top one. It's the advanced feedstocks and the power to liquids pathways that are expected to dominate the fuel mix into the future. And across these 4 different classes, I think there's some interesting considerations to dial down into. So yes, HEFA is feedstock supply constrained. And we don't expect there to be significant additional fats, oils, and greases available into the future. And so I agree with that, with the smaller size of that wedge. The advanced feedstock, so these would be general biomass, woody residues, agricultural residues, potentially dedicated energy crops. As a significant contributor into the future, it's important to really understand the feedstock dynamics there. So understanding location and distribution of that feedstock resource, which really drive the scale and the cost of the fuel produced. What's interesting is that there's really I did show a whole lot of options in terms of technology pathways, but there are, according to LEC's experience, very few, if any, technical routes from this class of feedstock to produce SAF that satisfy currently an acceptable financing risk without major commitment to completing technical development and reducing that engineering and early project risk. And that's a significant task that is ahead of the industry, is busting out for these advanced feedstocks from this kind of pioneer plant, early stage into the multiple future developments where that technology risk has been retired, and we're into the nth plant phase of project deployment. Waste gases, they are a significant current resource, but how to actually get those waste gases to become SAF, how to get them into the liquid hydrocarbon form, again, there is still technical and engineering risk, and so we get to see significant scale from those. Power to liquids, I was remiss not to mention them earlier. These are the so-called e-fuels or power to liquid fuels, where the feedstock is both carbon but hydrogen from renewable energy sources, and the carbon in whatever form, whether that's a gaseous form or a gasified biomass form, is converted into SAF through the addition of significant volumes of hydrogen from renewable energy. And there's significant potential, as you can see in these charts, for this pathway. But the challenge here is there sufficient excess and low cost renewable power available, and where that would be available. Again, this is an earlier TRL pathway, higher costs than the other pathways that we've just been discussing, but its significant future potential merits a close eye. Okay, next slide. So how then are these SAF supply chains coming together? So next slide. When we look at a greenfield development, building a SAF supply chain from scratch, these are long and complex supply chains. So you've got many different stakeholders needing to come together, many factors at play: policies, permitting, regulatory and policies, approvals, and credits. And you've got other forms of input required. So these are challenging supply chains. If we go into the next slide, we can see that we can kind of categorize the emerging pathways, or supply chains, I should say, based on, essentially on what that feedstock is. So the early developments for SAF, such as HEFA, have been based on feedstocks that are currently available at a commodity scale, like fats, oils, and greases. These supply chains are driven by policy and by expediency. Oh, there's a market. Oh, how can we get to that market and serve it quickly? Well, the easiest way is going to be just operating in the middle between a commodity input and a commodity output. They've been quicker to deploy, but they are more prone to competition, and as discussed, certainly for HEFA, more limited scalability. Then you have waste-based supply chains. For example, the concept around municipal solid waste being gasified and then converted into the SAF. These supply chains and business cases are driven by the margins in the business. Tipping fees, often in the early stage of development, there would be a credit or a negative cost feedstock available. But there are challenges both with the technology pathways here, but also with feed consistency and handling the variability of waste feeds seasonally and over time. Then you've got concepts around purpose-grown biomass. So these are supply chains where you're going out in a green field, literally a green field, and growing some new biomass. These are supply chain concepts, and I say concepts because we haven't really seen these mature yet, where they're driven at core by the benefits that biomass production deliver in the local environment, whether that's an environmental benefit or a social benefit. However, when you are growing something from scratch, you do have challenges around the costs of those feedstocks and what that's going to look like until you get to significant scales and the economies of scale that happen there. And then these power to liquid or e-fuels, these are really interesting because they are supply chains that have the potential to unlock renewable electricity production in areas where there's a failure or a challenge in the local electricity market. So you've got large areas of highly productive land for solar, but no local demand and no grid connection to actually sell that electricity to electricity consumers. These kinds of opportunities where a PTL, a SAF plant, could be that anchor tenant, that anchor demand for new solar, potential wind as well. Those are the really exciting and interesting opportunities for those e-fuel supply chains. Next slide. And I'll just leave you with this chart. Not that we're going to read every word on this page, but just to look at the life cycle of a SAF plant and kind of tee up how LEC and our interests and our capabilities and expertise can help support the development of a SAF plant. It's no mean feat to be able to do this from start to finish, and that's why we do have a constrained supply of SAF currently. From conceptualization to operation, you've got many years of development. For a heifer plant, pre-feasibility, you could be 6 to 12 months, and for a first of a kind, FOAK here, first of a kind or a pioneer plant, it could be 1 to 2 years just in the pre-feasibility step. Then you've got your feasibility and engineering and financing stages before you even start construction, which could be another 2 to 3 years. So there's along the top here, it shows the number of SAF refineries in these various stages, and this is a promising pipeline that there are hundreds of SAF refineries in that feasibility and financing phase, and over 100 through construction and operation. The third row there of text shows some of the expected costs, and again, it's not a cheap process to build a new biorefinery. Some big numbers there once you get into actually building, billions of dollars. And even getting to the point before you break ground, certainly multiple millions of dollars. And so advisors and experts such as LEC who can help project developers, help investors navigate these different steps are certainly a great way to reduce the risks of making these larger and larger investments over time in the development of a plant. So I'll just quickly preview then how LEC can support the SAF industry. Next 2 slides, please, with our newly launched Centre of Excellence. Next slide. So we have over 20 SAF experts at hand with, again, as JD mentioned up front, with a large amount of expertise and experience each. And we can help in areas such as market analysis, technology evaluation, engineering support, TEA, LCA, regulatory analysis, etc. Next slide. So we're certainly across a wide range of technologies, and we can provide tailored client support to a wide range of different types of SAF stakeholders, from governments and development banks through to project developers, technology developers, and airlines and those who wish to be consumers of SAF. And with that, I would, next slide, like to introduce three of my esteemed colleagues who are going to join us for the Q&A. We've got Bob Baldwin, who's a SAF technology and pathway expert, Stefan Unash, who has deep experience in policy and LCA, and Andrew Grant, who has a strong expertise in the engineering support for developing projects. So I think we'll hand it back to JD for moderating a Q&A. Thank you.
Michael, thank you. That was incredibly informative. You got through a lot of information there. And Robert, Stefan, Andrew, good to see you guys. Okay, so the first question comes from Joel Stone. Joel, can you unmute and ask about technology platforms, that question for you?
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yep.
Didn't want to unmute me there for a second. No, Mike, I was just wondering wanted to get your perspectives on what do you think are at the present time, this can all change over years, but just curious, what do you think are the leading technology platforms right now? If someone wanted to build a facility, which one sort of catches any of your eyes as far as being the way to go? Is there one or two or three that stand out?
I'll pass the answer to that question to Andrew to provide his insight. Are you unmuted, Andrew?
Andrew, Bob, and Stefan, you guys need to unmute yourself. You have been enabled
okay,
for
very
video.
good.
And
I think you can hear me.
Yep,
Okay,
there we go.
Mercedes?
yes, sir.
Yep.
Yep.
Hey, Joel, thanks for the $64 billion question, eh?
Yeah, correct.
We'll run a fund on this. Somebody's going to win it. Perhaps it's more productive to say which ones of the 50 potential technologies won't work, and you end up with just a few that have a decent chance. And that's really our record in LEC for doing these things for our customers, is starting out with a list of maybe 30 technologies, whittling it down to half a dozen that have some chance, and doing a detailed evaluation. It's a tough job. So quite frankly, Joel, I haven't the faintest idea. What I can point out is that many major companies have blown $1 billion here, $2 billion there on failed biomass conversion technologies. So some very bright, very competent, very experienced people have blown all their money. So I'm not going to stick my neck out, but I can help find out and point out what is not going to work and how to make a promising technology get financing.
No, fair enough, Andrew. It was sort of a loaded question because amazingly enough, next Friday, Friday the 21st on the Wolfpack, we've got 6 companies that we're going to review, which are all related to SAF. It's going to be an interesting conversation, to say the least. So,
I would say, which way do you like your pain?
Data or press releases?
what's that?
Are they offering engineering data or press releases?
Most everything is press releases. The problem that we find as the Wolfpack is there's very little detail offered into the technology. So we have to make assumptions and make judgment calls relative to the approach they're taking. But there is becoming a common thread, and the common thread on many of the large facilities is having them include some type of geological carbon capture and sequestration in order to lower their CI score.
Yep. And improve their financing. Yep, their revenue.
Yeah, that gives more reason for financing, but it also creates a huge uptick in CapEx.
Right. Yes.
Stefan,
I think you put your finger on,
had
Joel, if I
something
could make a
to
comment.
Well, yeah, one way to characterize these also is how do you like your pain? Do you like high feedstock or operating cost, or do you like high capital cost? If you like high feedstock cost, you go with HEFA, where the feedstock will always cost more than diesel, or you go to e-fuels, where it's hard to get that to be below $3 a gallon.
Right.
If you like high capital cost, you look at pyrolysis and FT, where arguably your feedstock is cheaper.
Okay.
That's a good
Thank you.
point.
Michael, can I
All
just
right.
throw in a comment?
Yeah, please.
Joel, I think folks are watching very closely the alcohol to jet experiment going on at Freedom Pines in Georgia, and hoping that that's going to be successful. That'll be a huge that'll be another very significant data point, and I think ATJ coupled with cellulosic ethanol to give the low CI that you need. That's in my opinion. That's going to be the next technology after HEFA.
All right. Let's move to the next question. David Peterson, can you unmute and ask your question?
Absolutely. Thanks for this very informative question and answer session. As a kind of natural connection to what Joel asked as a question on technology, do you feel there's some sort of projection you could make on preferred feedstock for SAF?
Yeah, great question. And let's give Stefan the first chop at this, because with his view on LCA and policy, those are big drivers of choices around feedstock. Right. So, Stefan, what would you say?
Well, there's a pretty split equal camps of FT developers with biomass gasification. There's a lot of ethanol to jet projects. Those are the ones that prefer high feedstock costs, but a simpler technology. And there hasn't really been much happening with landfill gas or dairy gas. There isn't much of that. Those are sort of the three camps. They all have their merits, and they're all being aggressively developed with lots of projects that are trying to get to a final investment decision. But many of them lead to very low CIs. The problem is today, who's paying? The shoe's about to drop on the IRA, I would think. I can't imagine that DOGE really likes the IRA being paid for out of the national debt. So surviving the policy landscape and while getting funded is going to be tricky.
Right. That's a good point. My heart and soul is more in the area of a woody biomass, and that's been a very tricky feedstock source to use as a source of fuel.
Yeah, high collection and transportation costs for those kinds of biomass, woody biomass feedstocks, even agricultural residue feedstocks, but some significant sustainability benefits, especially in the mountain west of the US, where forest health initiatives can drive the removal of biomass from forests. So some really interesting opportunities there, but do require that additional support, whether that is a bottom line financial support or the support of local stakeholders in helping manage the fire risk and forest health, to get that biomass out of the forests and collected and transported to a biorefinery that's close enough to make the economics of the feedstock work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, true. Thank
All
you.
right. Thanks, David. Next question is from Pete Rosha. Pete, are you able to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, I am. Thanks, JD. So, Michael, first of all, thanks so much for all the great information. Really good to hear about the progress of these different technologies. So, my kind of question was in the realm of synthetic fuels, or as you called it, power to liquids, the same thing. So, basically, the pathway combining renewable hydrogen with CO2. Realistically, when do you think some of those technologies might be at scale to where they might make a meaningful impact in the SAF marketplace? Thank you.
Yeah, so currently the costs are prohibitive for project development for these e-synthetic or powder liquid fuels. The best projections that I've seen show sort of the 2030s as when deployment starts to ramp up for the power to liquids. And there's a pretty strong analytical consensus around that. The coming decade is going to be biomass or carboniferous feedstock dominated, the projects that are built. And then sort of mid 2030s, we start to see eSAF projects being deployed, and over the coming decades, they become the ones that are dominant in the project development pipeline. But there are a lot of factors at play. Currently too expensive. What's going to happen to reduce those costs? Increased scale of electricity supply, technology development in the technology pathway itself, better catalysts, etc., better electrolyzers. And there's a fair amount of uncertainty around the trajectory of those drivers, but it's certainly not in the coming decade. I wouldn't expect to be a significant rollout of eSAF.
All right. Thank you, Pete. We do have some external questions as well, Michael. I just sort of note that we're hoping to kind of close up around 3 o'clock. Doesn't have to be exact, but we have 3 more questions, and then we do have a couple internal housekeeping items. So if we could maybe just take a crack. Timothy Rose, if you could ask your question, unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks very much. This has been a fascinating insight. I'm just wondering what limits the blend ratios. I saw blend ratios in the chart that Michael presented down at 5%, maximum of 50. As the fuels are chemically similar, backwards and forwards compatible, drop in, etc. What governs that blend ratio, assuming we had a limitless supply of SAF? It's not quantity related.
Good pick up, and there are some technical nuances here, which I'll let Bob Baldwin answer this question. Bob, if you can unmute.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, of course, the question isn't relevant now because supplies are so small that even meeting a 5% blend is not realistic. But I believe the answer is that it's just an ASTM decision to be extremely conservative in the way they bring these fuels to the marketplace. They are drop-in fuels. They're chemically and in every way completely compatible with fossil jet fuel. So there's no reason why these blend limits have to exist other than just simply bringing them on slowly to make sure there won't be problems. Michael, is that a fair assessment?
I think that there is a conservatism there. The nuance that I kind of glossed over when I say they're chemically indistinguishable, the blends are, but the SAF blend stock, the pure SAF itself, some of them represent different components of the range of the thousands of molecules that are in petroleum jet fuel. So you've got HEFA, for example, produces predominantly linear hydrocarbons. Whereas in jet fuel, there are cyclized hydrocarbons, there are aromatics as well. And so some of these SAF technologies, and this is really what drives those different blend limits, only represent a portion or a subsection of what's in that fossil fuel mix of components. And so there are some compatibility issues where you can't use 100% for certain of these SAF technologies, just to maintain compatibility with the engine and air and sort of fuel supply components of the system.
And it's hard to hit the density spec. So HEFA tends to be like 760 grams per liter, whereas the ASTM spec is 775 to 840. And a blend, you could blast away the blend with aromatics, but pure aromatics isn't really the solution, because that's not the greatest jet fuel either.
Yeah, and there are. I will add that the airframers, Boeing and Airbus, are working on demonstrating 100% SAF compatibility, and there have been some flights to show that it's technically feasible. And so we don't expect that in the long run there will be any hard limitations on how much SAF can be used. I would expect in the long run it'll be 100% SAF as the industry moves to fully decarbonize.
Excellent. Thank you for clearing that up. Obviously, a cautious approach is probably best considering the ultimate application of the fuel. So, yeah, thanks. This is absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks,
okay, next question. And I think we're going to have to wrap it up on this one. But Andrew Krivoff, are you able to unmute and ask your question? Okay, why don't I ask it for you, and then she may have had to drop off because we are getting to the top of the hour. She says, thank you for the presentation, Michael. What are your thoughts on SAF derived from advanced feedstocks like microalgae?
Oh, lots of thoughts. This is what got me into SAF in the first place, was that I knew a thing or two about microalgae. That was my PhD. Look, it's a great idea, apart from the cost. Like growing microalgae is very, very expensive. So you're taking a very high cost feedstock and trying to make a business out of selling into one of the lowest value commodity markets there is. So the margins just aren't there for from microalgae. It's way too expensive to grow those.
Okay. All right.
JD, can I make a question?
Can you? Of course you can, Andrew. Go ahead.
Thank you, JD. This is a question, not an answer, okay? In the work we've been doing recently, especially with Michael's team, we've realized that financial engineering is just as important as technology and project engineering. The project we did for the Pacific Airlines was a wonderful example of that. It's not just capital cost structure, it's revenue structure, it's how you organize the feedstock. Those are all examples of financial engineering. I'd just like to appeal to all our LEC members here. If you have examples of innovative financial engineering you've come across, please let us know, because we've done very well by using some smart ideas. We could do with more, right, Michael?
I agree. Thank you, Andrew. The SAF journey has moved from an era of technology innovation driving progress to, as you say, now the technology's there. What we need innovation and creativity around is how to finance and contract and build up those projects and those business cases that behind those projects. So that's a really good point, is that the needs have changed from lab coats to calculators.
Right. I have one late-breaking question. Gabrielle Montana, are you still on? Would you like to unmute and ask your question before we move on?
Sure, I'm on, and thank you very much for the presentation. My question, and I realize this may be still early stages to ascertain, but given that the industry relies so heavily on price subsidies and mandates, and given the current policy environment, is there an industry view developing about kind of the future of pricing evolution and the environment for growth?
Yeah, I think that there's a let's say up until November of last year, there was a consensus around the trajectory of the cost of carbon, and I say that very deliberately. Whether that is the cost is applied in the form of mandatory offsets or applied somehow to the operating or price of the fuel, the operating cost of the fuel, that those were continuing to increase over time, and by the mid 2030s would be at such a level that economy-wide that the cost of carbon would be sufficient to drive the business case for SAF, despite this cost price gap that we're currently experiencing. Now, of course, the world's kind of changed pretty rapidly over the last few months, and the impacts of a US withdrawal from Paris commitments, for example, are yet to be seen. It's a more challenging future to forecast. Despite all of that, there are, even in the current low carbon pricing environment, there are projects going ahead, and we expect that the natural cost curve reduction that comes with deployment, learning by doing, and ultimately economies of scale to continue. It just may be that kind of inflection point of a standalone competitiveness may be somewhat delayed due to volatile geopolitics.
All right. Well, I bet we could go on for another 20 minutes or a half hour with questions. If you do have questions while we're still on, please submit them. I'll get them to Michael. He can divide them up with the team. But I'd just like to take a minute to say thank you to Michael, Bob, Andrew, and Stefan for being a part of this today. Excellent, really excellent job. We were happy to have you, and we're looking forward to doing a lot more SAF work down the road together. And with that, I'm sorry, a little music. So, David, did you want to maybe do the introduction for your recommendation and your bid for Joel?
Well, thank you, JD. I just wanted to, everybody could read what I wrote. Joel is just an absolute all-star, very insightful, goes the extra mile in his contributions. Just a real gentleman, very fun to have on a project. So thank you, Joel, for your contributions.
I mean, I can second or third that. If Joel is available, Joel, would you like to come on and say a few words before we...
Yeah, I'm here.
There you are, sir.
Yeah.
Good man.
Thanks so much for the positive comments, David. It's been a thrill working with you and others at LEC, and we've had some very interesting projects. We just finished up one. I finished up one with Mike Sticklin. I don't know whether Mike's on or not, with a large multinational engineering firm that we got pretty big kudos for. It was a fairly significant project covering a facility in Hungary and one in Wisconsin. So it had some interesting approaches with regard. And my thanks go out to you, Michael, and the rest of the team on the SAF presentation. That's great. I mean, it's a lot of moving parts to say the least. I've been involved. I might want to talk with you some more on SAF because I've done quite a bit of work on when I was president of Green Biologics on conversion of butanol to jet fuel, but the economics just never worked. Why would you sell jet fuel if you could sell butanol for much higher value for lubricants, whatever? So
Yeah,
we ditched it.
Welcome to the challenge.
Yeah,
Multiple feedstocks, right?
But thanks so much.
We would be remiss, Joel, to not let everyone know that you've been nominated for the Bioeconomy Engineer of the Year. And for all of you who have your iPhones out, you can scan this QR code and go right into the voting. Vote often. I shouldn't say that, but we would appreciate it. It's highly welcomed, and Joel has been an integral part of LEC for a long time. He is the OG in a lot of cases for a lot of different vertical markets, and we're just thrilled to see him get recognized from the outside world as well as by us here at LEC. So with that, I hope everyone has a great month. Sorry we ran 9 or 10 minutes over, but you also have QR codes here to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, LinkedIn newsletter. And if you would like to relive this or other webinars, they exist on the LEC YouTube channel, which can be found with that QR code there. So without further ado, I hope everyone has a good rest of day. And Michael and team, thanks again for bringing together a ton of great information. Thanks to the audience for a lot of great questions. And we will see you guys soon. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.